Welcome to a special episode of the Right Side Up podcast with me, your host, Danielle Strickland. Maybe like me, you've been baffled and confused about what's going on in America right now, especially as it relates to immigration. We have a special guest with us, the Reverend Dr. Alexia Salvatierra, to help us understand and give us the facts about what is actually happening and what we can do in response. Dr. Salvatierra is an formidable leader, preacher, teacher, advocate, and has been involved in bipartisan immigrant reform in America for over 40 years. This episode is eye-opening and heartbreaking, and believe it or not, a catalyst for finding our courage as Christians. Welcome. I'm glad you are here.
Okay, welcome to the Right Side Up podcast with Danielle Strickland and usually James Scholl, but today we have a special guest and a special episode around the reality facing our American brothers and sisters and the global community around immigration and what's happening in America right now. And Alexia Salvatierra, we have in the house. She is here. She will explain herself, her own background and her experience as a Jesus follower, a disciple, but also as a trainer and a teacher and a writer and as someone who has advocated and who is working hard to serve others in this season. And maybe we could just start with what is going on in America right now. I am Canadian, so I'm over here watching some different news channels, hearing some different news.
Sure.
Trying to piece it together. I have lots of friends in America who work with immigration resettlement, refugee claimants and things like that, who are really sad and scared and almost bewildered about what's happening, but that's not always what we see. So I wonder maybe if you could just give us a quick picture on what is happening right now in America.
Sure, Danielle. So let me start just by saying that I've been involved with our immigration system for about 45 years. So I have a few different titles. I'm a pastor, I'm a professor, I'm a dean. But my favorite title I actually wear in a little necklace around my neck, which is madrina, and that means godmother. And it was given to me by one of my mentees. But it's used because it's used by many of my mentees. And it's a way of honoring that I've been engaged with this work for so long. And when I say this work, I mean the response of the church to immigrants and on multiple levels, not only the response in terms of direct ministry, but the response in terms of advocacy for immigrant justice. So I was one of the Central American Sanctuary Movement in 1980. I was very young then, and I was I was one of the co-founders of the New Sanctuary Movement in 2005. And the Evangelical Immigration Table in 2012. And then the A Guardian Angels Project working with unaccompanied migrant minors in court in 2014, and then something called Matthew 25 in 2016, which is a network of believers, immigrant and non-immigrant, working together to accompany families facing separation through deportation, and then later asylum seekers. So I give you that history just to say that I have been working with immigration issues through a variety of administrations, even up to and including the last administration of President Trump. And I have never seen anything like this in my life. The new executive orders, which are being implemented, are draconian in every sense of the word. So I know that the rhetoric was that they were going to focus on criminals. But in fact, that is what President Obama did, that he had a prioritization of deportation where he focused on people he saw as a public threat. So these were people with violent crimes, etc. One of the executive orders takes away all prioritization, says that any person who has crossed the border undocumented is by definition a criminal. So there are a number of implications to that, and there are implications that are more specific. So, for example, they're taking away temporary protected status. Temporary protected status applies to people who come from a country that is internationally recognized as a disaster, as a place where human rights violations and persecution are happening all the time. And so you can give that designation to a country so that the people who are fleeing that country have an opportunity, they have some time to prove that they're individually in danger of violent persecution, which is the standard. for receiving ultimately asylum status or refugee status, which is the same thing. The only difference between asylum and refugee is where you apply. If you apply in a refugee center outside of this country, or if you apply at a border. And these are international definitions. So people who have temporary protected status get a chance to apply and to go through a process. They still have to pass a test called legitimate fear, which is that someone who's a border official has to say this person has legitimate fear of persecution. But then they can get temporary protected status, they can get a work permit, and they go through the courts.
Yeah.
But
So
just
to break this down so that everybody understands, because I think sometimes there's such a high level of ignorance or just like unknownness around these issues. It's so easy to just like say something. So what we're saying is somebody flees a war, let's say, or a famine, or like there's a gang that's like put a hit out on a friend of mine worked for a company and was like the accountant for a really big company. And a gang said, we want you to steal money for us. And he said, I will not. And then they put a hit out on his family, literally a sign on the front of his door. And so he could not return to his house. He had to flee immediately from his country.
And actually, let me break in there for a minute in that story. Is that he can only actually get asylum if not only did that happen to him, but his government was unwilling or unable to protect him. Right. So in some governments, the government is in league with the gangs.
Yes. So there was no answer but to flee. So with his wife, his wife is a doctor. He was like high up in accounting sort of stuff, very intelligent science stuff, took his children and fled for his life. And then that person would arrive as a refugee. Let's say he went to America. I knew him from Canada, but let's say he went to America. The law is that he gets a temporary
protected status. So let me back up. Not necessarily. He only gets temporary protected status if the federal government has decided, usually after exhaustive vet, that the country that he's running from has a very high level of that kind of violence and persecution going on. And then the people coming from that country get this designation, which gives them time because they get to the border. And by the way, this is legal. Anybody who signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with the United Nations, Universal Declaration, which we helped create in 1951. So any country who signed that basically commits themselves to what's called the right of non-refoulement, that you can't send someone back to die. So you do a test at the border if someone comes to your border to decide whether they have a legitimate fear of persecution. And then if they do, they can enter. Now, if they have temporary protected status, they're in a special situation. There's a presumption that they may have a case because we know how bad things are in their country. But they still have to prove their individual case. They still have to go through a series of hearings. They have to go through extensive vetting.
But they are now already in a legal process.
Right. They're already in a legal process and they have legal status. But the administration, one of the executive orders is that they're removing temporary protected status.
Right. And so that I think is
called humanitarian parole, which covers people from the Ukraine, people from Afghanistan.
Right. So I think this is the thing people don't understand is that because it's been painted by the administration as we're just going after anyone who's entered this country illegally.
Right.
But actually, we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of people who have entered legally.
That's right. And now he is making it with a stroke of the pen illegal for them to be here. So they're in a process. They're going through court. They have a work permit and suddenly they are criminals. And they're actually...
Because they've gone through so this is the other thing that is actually shocking is because they've gone through a legal process, they can be found.
Oh, yes, of course. They have ankle bracelets on. They can easily be found. In fact,
they have submitted
the story that just was in the news from the chief in Atlanta was that the man was going through the asylum process and he had an ankle bracelet on.
Yeah, that's in Christianity Today, by the way, for the listeners. There's an article called When ICE Comes to Church. And it quotes you, of course, but it also tells the story of this one specific person that was taken from their church. And they tracked him through his legal monitoring system that he had fully submitted to because he was entering the country legally. That is a legal entry. So they have used the very legal process to actually find, track, and deport people, pretending that they've made it illegal. They made the legal process illegal.
That's exactly right. And therefore they can deport people. They can call them criminals because they've made it a crime to be here. for these people.
Except they technically they did not. And I'm sure there are some people, just like there are people everywhere, who have committed a crime. But the vast majority of the people we're talking about here are people who have entered legally in good faith and participating fully in a system that exists and has always or has existed for some time, and overnight have been told that system actually doesn't exist anymore. And
it gets worse than that also, Danielle. Let me just tell you
keep telling me, because it seems so baffling to me that the news is good. We're cleaning up the border and we're getting rid of criminals. But actually what we're doing is quite literally changing the law overnight, or not even changing the law. Like there is actually no due process, no legal, this hasn't gone through the courts. This is an executive order that has betrayed thousands and thousands of people who have submitted to a legal process.
Let me tell you where it gets even worse. So some of these states, when people have fled from a state that is a failed state, like Venezuela. So Venezuela is a communist government. It's a leftist government. It's known for it. We have a temporary protected status because Venezuela is a nightmare. 7 million people have fled, and they are all over Latin America. Only about 500,000 have come here. Mostly they've gone to Colombia or to Costa Rica, right? But Venezuela not only is a place where if you send people back to, they could die. It's also a place, in fact, where there's a strong likelihood that they would die. That's why there's temporary protected status. But it's also a place that has refused to take people back. So if they refuse to take people back, and a Trump administration and envoy just went there to try to twist their arm to take people back, but they still haven't agreed. If they refuse to take people back, the latest thing that the president is saying is that he's going to send people to Guantanamo.
Yeah, he says he can hold 30,000
Venezuela won't take them back. So
people.
If another country like Mexico won't take them, he's trying to get Mexico to take them. That was part of what the 25% tariffs was about, is trying to get Mexico to take them.
And then El Salvador, I heard he's also...
Yes, and El Salvador is a whole other story, and we can talk about that. But he's trying to get different countries to take them all. But if he can't get a country to take people, then as far as I know, this is the first time that we've ever tried to send people to a different country that aren't from that country. So, but if we can't send them, he's talking about using Guantanamo. He's saying that he would be in a situation where there's no human rights protections.
Well, that's what I was going to say. A lot of people don't realize that the reason Guantanamo was set up was so that it wasn't on American soil.
Yes.
So that no rights that are afforded prisoners or humans in America had to be actually followed or respected there. So it is a horrific premise for even having, we want to set up a prison that we can torture people, we can do whatever we like without anybody saying anything. And the only way we could do that is in some place that is not our own country, because this would be highly illegal in our own country. So this is the place that he wants to expand.
He wants to send people like the story you just told. He wants to send people who are running from violent persecution in their own country, and he wants to send them to Guantanamo because the country that they're running from wouldn't take them.
And because he keeps using this rhetoric that they've done something wrong by seeking asylum, which is actually just a basic human right that all of us would do and all of us have the right to do. Wow, it is dumbfounding, isn't it? So you've been doing this for 40 plus years, and you've been advocating at the highest levels and the bottom levels,
Democrat, even the first Trump administration.
And you're just like, like you've never seen this before. Like you've never seen this before.
No, to add that we've had a broken. So we're talking right now about people who are seeking asylum, but there's actually three. When people talk about standing in line, there's three lines you can stand in to immigrate to the United States. Only three. People don't realize that you can't immigrate for the American dream. That's not a possibility since 1965. You can immigrate for what we call blood, sweat, or tears. Blood is a family relationship with a citizen. It's only certain family relationships, but a family relationship with a citizen or permanent resident. And sometimes that can take a very long time. It can take up to 22, 23 years. If it's a lower category, like a permanent resident trying to bring their sister from the Philippines, that can be 22 or 23 years. But that's one category. It's called blood. So husbands can petition for their wives or vice versa, etc. Right? And the second category is called sweat. And sweat means that we that a business can show that they've tried to get American workers and they can't get American workers, and therefore they can petition for somebody who is not an American to come and work for them. That's the sweat category. And then the tears categories. It's blood, sweat, and tears. And tears are refugees and asylees, right? During the first Trump administration, they only took about 11,000 refugees or asylees, people in that category, in the tears category, per year. Historically, it's been between 60,000 and 120,000. President Biden brought it up to 100,000 because he was concerned about the fact that during the pandemic, we couldn't take anybody. So we had a lot of people waiting to try to come in. People wait in refugee camps. If they're going through that process, they can wait years. They go through extensive vetting.
What is the average wait in a refugee camp? Is 12 years or something like that?
Yeah, it's insane.
It's high. It's a really high. It's way higher than you think.
So one of the other executive orders is that we're essentially stopping all asylum and refugee. All asylum, all refugee. We have
everybody that's waiting in a refugee camp that has gone through the process for 12 years.
More.
It's
even
just,
if they
you're done.
Have family members here. So we've stopped all USAID, which means, and we've withdrawn from the United Nations Human Rights, which deals with all refugees in the camps. So now we're not sending funding to the camps. So we're not sending any funding to refugees outside the country, in the camps. And we've been a major funder, especially in countries where there's a totalitarian regime. And so we're not sending any funding, and we're also not allowing any to come.
Okay. So this is unprecedented. It is crazy times. Like everybody in this field is just like, this can't even be happening.
They've also stopped all payments for refugees that are here. We're not talking about asylum seekers who are going through the process. We're talking about people who have been given refugee status in the United States. They get a caseworker so that they get integrated into our society for a certain period of time, and they get a certain amount of funding, which then decreases over time to pay rent and get settled. All that money ended
overnight
on the 30th. And I haven't even talked about deferred. I started to give you the blood, sweat, and tears because we have people in the blood and sweat categories that are in a category called deferred deportation, which is what applies to all the dreamers. If some of your listeners have heard of the dreamers were people who were brought here as small children. They've lived all their lives here. They've gone to school here. They haven't even been back. Like they wouldn't even know their country. English is their primary language.
Right.
They're, and so they are known for contributing to this country. They've had work permits and the legal right to go to higher education since 2012. And they are some of our best and brightest. But they are all because there's one little sentence called the ban that says if you've been in this country more than, in our immigration policy, that says if you've been in this country more than a year, undocumented, and it can be proven, and of course they went to school here, so you can prove that they were here, that you have to go back to your home country for 10 years before applying, even if you have what they call a qualifying case. So you're married to an American, you're working for an American company, they love you, you'd have to go back to your home country for 10 years. So these people are in a state called deferred deportation. They are not a priority for deportation because we recognize that we as a country are trying to work through what to do about them. And so we give them deferred deportation. Beyond the dreamers, and we've got about 750,000 dreamers at this point, beyond the dreamers, there are other people who are in a deferred deportation process, all of them because of a crazy little regulation, one or another, that makes it hard for us to pay attention to their qualifying cases. So if they contribute to this country in a way that there's clear evidence that they're contributing, if they don't commit any crimes, they stay through this process of trying to figure out their own individual case or trying to deal with a larger wrinkle in the system. All of those people are now equal priority for deportation. People who have asylum are higher priority for deportation. People who are in the asylum seeking process are highest priority for deportation. But people who are...
Why? They've just said they're the easiest ones?
People who are in the deferred deportation category are now the same priority as a convicted felon. So I'll get to the why, but I just wanted you to understand that that's what we're talking about. We're talking about people who are part of the fabric of our community, who have been here 20 years. One of the issues in the sweat category, one of the reasons why we end up with deferred deportation and sweat, is because we have quotas. Besides just showing that you can't find an American citizen, we have quotas for different categories. And some of the quotas have nothing to do with reality. So we accept 1,000 visas per year for unskilled labor, including all farm labor. Since the beginning of this country, we have imported about 70 to 80% of our farm labor. The slavery was a giant program to import farm labor. In Canada, you actually have a system that uses a computer to determine your labor needs and then gives visas accordingly. So you have about the same percentage of farm workers we do, but they're all legal. We can't give them legal status, right? So somebody who is an amazing worker in the fields may end up with deferred deportation because they can't get a visa because there's a backlog that goes back so many years. But we need those workers. So all the people that we're talking about deporting right now, we have a desperate need for low-wage workers in this country. And we're trying to get rid of all our low workers. It's not even in any sense good for American society.
Yeah,
So
this
you
is the
ask
thing.
why.
Okay, so this is the thing I think is oftentimes when we talk about immigration, we're always, at least when we hear it in the general, and certainly through this latest administration lens, it's always like people who need our help. And we never talk about immigration through the lens of actually, this is a mutual exchange. Like there's some benefit for sure that we can give to people, and we ought to because we're humans and they're humans, and there's this thing called rights and we all need them. But also there's this other thing where there's like much that's given and much that's received and much that's like a benefit to the country. And I think anyone that knows the history of any, Canada as well, without immigration, there is no Canada, there is no country. Like all of us have been on this journey. So I guess that's the other piece is maybe just people don't, or we haven't celebrated enough or said it enough or explored it even in our own story and our own narrative. But like, this is essential for our thriving.
Yes, we depend on immigrant labor as a country, and we always have. And every country in the world does. And we are also an aging country. We have a low birth rate. And that means that we have a particular need over the next 10 years for immigrant labor in order to be able to maintain our level of prosperity. And that's not an article of contention. The last proposal for comprehensive immigration reform, which was it was completely bipartisan, half Republicans, half Democrats. And it had a whole section focused on exactly this question of how our need for immigrant labor and how we make sure that we have the immigrant labor that we need in order to maintain a certain level of prosperity.
So tell me why then, because if
Well,
this is going to tank the labor, like what is this about really?
I can tell you why, actually.
Okay, tell me.
In a way that I didn't make up or discern. So I talked about that 2013 legislation, which was really a compromise. Like nobody was completely happy with it, but it really would have solved a lot of the problems. It would have ended up with a much more effective, logical, and humane system. So, it passed the Senate. And when it got to the House, we had enough Democratic and Republican votes to pass it. We had counted votes. We had promises. We knew we had enough to pass it. And it was very popular. When we ran the elements of the proposal, not immigration reform as a title, but the elements of the proposal past the average American, we were getting 70% support. People liked it. They want an immigration system that is effective, logical, and humane. So it didn't get to the floor for a vote. Why didn't it get to the floor for a vote? Because Senator Ted Cruz and another senator from the Republican Party went to the Speaker of the House and they said to him, do not take it to the floor for a vote. It's not good for us to solve the problem is good for us politically. Solving it is not.
Wow.
So,
and you mean the problem is good for us politically in that then we have a crutch of like what the problem is?
Well, we can scapegoat immigrants.
We can blame immigrants for everything.
And we can rile up anti-immigrant sentiment. That means that we've seen what a strong political force it is, and not only here, everywhere in the world. Now, I do need to say that people that push for open borders are also not helpful because people who would like a sane system aren't even heard in the conversation, right?
Right. And this is what you've been working on for 45 plus years is like a safe, sane, good system where everybody wins. Like this is everybody could win. This is the principle of mutuality where everybody actually contributes and everybody receives. And we have this is just a pipe dream, or not like open borders and no security or anything like that. This is just good human sense.
Yes. I'm a Lutheran pastor, so I teach in an evangelical seminary, and I consider myself an evangelical, but I am a Lutheran pastor. So we are part of the Reformed tradition, and the Reformed tradition believes that everybody is sinner and saint, that institutions are neither holy nor evil, that institutions are flawed and useful for God's purposes. And so we do believe in limits and boundaries and borders in the Reformed tradition. We just believe that they can be kept ethically. They can be kept humanely. They can be kept in a way that serves us all. The proposal that we had in 2013 would have done that from my perspective.
Right.
Not that I loved everything in it, but it would have certainly gone a long ways towards that goal.
And so it was intentionally side-roaded because this illegal immigrant, and I'm using quotation marks for those who are undocumented workers, or blaming somebody, scapegoating the problems that America faces on somebody other than American politicians, particularly, was needed. So this is just the easiest thing to blame. And it's textbook. Like you said, it's not just in America. This is happening. This is happening in other places too.
And, part of what I would also really like to say, Danielle, at this moment in history, is that some of our strongest allies in the Republican Party have been running scared, more and more of them over time. They know that we need a certain amount of immigrant labor. They know that most of the people coming from Venezuela are normal, hardworking, decent families who are fleeing an absolutely terrible situation. They know, they don't not know. They know that dreamers really need to be integrated into our society legally and officially because they're contributing an enormous amount. They know all of that, but they are terrified of this wave of anti-immigrant sentiment. And the image that I have of their terror is the image of an uncontained fire. I have just been through an uncontained fire in Los Angeles. We have just been through an absolutely horrendous experience of multiple uncontained fires that burned something like 10,000 structures in the city, more than that. I can't remember the exact number. But the experience of an uncontained fire is that you can't defend your home, right?
Right.
I mean, there were a few people who were able to do that, but mostly people who tried to defend their home, people didn't even try. They saw the fire. It was a wall of fire coming at you, and there was nothing you could do but get out of there and save your life. And I remember that the fire chief said at one point that all you can do when a fire is completely uncontained, and of course what made it that way is that we had a terrible windstorm. We had like a tornado and a fire at the same time. And so the wind carried the embers for 2 miles and lit houses on fire. So it was just an awful situation. But what the fire chief said was, in a moment of uncontained fire, all you can do is save people's lives. You can try to set a parameter beyond which the fire cannot go, and you can put out spot fires because the embers fly over the perimeter. So I feel like the fear of all politicians right now of the current administration, but particularly Republicans who have been warned that if they counter in any way, they will be primaried, that all of Elon Musk's billions of dollars will be, and all of his capacity to promote information, true or false, will be used to get them out if they stand up in any way. They're having the experience of an uncontained fire coming in. And this fire has been stoked and built over a number of years until the average American thinks immigrant and thinks felon, completely in opposition to the reality. There's fewer than 1% of the population of the United States is a felon. Fewer than half of that among immigrants are felons.
Right.
Because
because they have so much more to lose. Like, it's already hard.
Exactly.
Right. So like, it's actually way harder.
So it doesn't
way worse.
mean there are no criminals, but it's the vast minority, not the vast majority. But at this point, the wave of fire of anti-immigrant sentiment, of people blaming immigrants for problems that are much more profound in our society, some of which will be greatly worsened by these policies.
What's the best way, what would you advise people to do on this steady diet they've been fed? So people have been, I call it the diet of fear that we've been on for years now. We're just a steady diet of fear, particularly using the scapegoat mechanism. What's your best practice for people?
Perfect love casts out fear. And so, definitely faith casts out fear. Faith allows us to take a breath and to actually figure out where God is in the situation and where we need to be, because wherever God is, that's where we need to be.
Right.
So faith helps us to take a breath and do that. But then beyond faith, if you love, there was one of my students, my doctoral students, is studying conservative evangelicals in the Southern Baptist Church who practice hospitality to immigrants. He's studying them. And he's studying, why are they different?
Interesting.
Right? Like what happened to them?
So even within the same conservative theological framework, those who practice hospitality towards the stranger,
right? So
are different
he's
from
been studying them. And so
wow,
what did he find? He found first that they know immigrants. That at some point in their life, they got to know immigrants. And so when they began hearing all the rhetoric, they were like, but that's not Marcos. Right. Or that's not, Lee, because immigrants are not just from South America or Latin America or Central America, right? They're from all over.
Yeah, I have this great story of my son, because we hosted refugees over many years in our home. And my son went to school one day and they had this big discussion about refugees, and it was all filled with some of this rhetoric. And my son just put up his hand and said, that's not what it's been like for Abby. That's not what it's been like. He just was like, he's like, in grade 4 or something, but he's like, this isn't true. Like, I know who you're talking about. And I think that's such a Jesus-centered approach to, this is Jesus. Like, if you would move towards the person that you're afraid of, if you would move towards and across social boundaries that have tried to separate us and see through lenses of fear, you would discover actually that things are different. People are sacred. So that's amazing.
Piece of that, and there are certainly, first of all, the vast majority of people that come are Christians.
Right. So actually, from a Christian perspective, because you're also an educator, Christian educator, and I wonder about, I've read a bunch of things where the best possible news of revival in America is through immigrants.
Absolutely. With the immigrant churches are bringing revival. So that's one. And then when immigrants are not Christians, the mission field is coming to our door. And then I remember a man asking, he said, but what if they're Muslim? Those are our enemies. And I said, what did Jesus say about enemies?
Right. Right.
So, there's this, the heart of Jesus. If we have the heart of Jesus, it really shifts the fear. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and it brings the fear down to a place where we can begin to ask logical questions. Like, are there other alternatives other than throwing everybody out? Is there another alternative? What would that alternative look like? You can start asking those questions. What was interesting is that, in this, going back to this study, part of what they found is that the more and more people got to know immigrants and refugees, the more they decided to stop listening to the kinds of news and the kinds of social media that would pull them away from the heart of Christ. They just stopped.
Yep.
They said, I'm not going to be fed by that poison. I'm going to be fed by the word. I'm going to be a Jesus follower in the world. I
think this season too, it's really interesting to me because I feel like if your church or your so-called Christian formation is also fear-based, is also like, if it mirrors the news, then you also might not actually be in a Christian. That might not be what they say it is. Like, because I feel like that's one of the problems, is that a lot of this stuff is dressed up as a Christian. J.D. Vance just got on the news and talked about how the Christian priority is to love your family first and then to love, and it was like, what? Like, that's so far from the Jesus way, so far from the New Testament. Literally so far from the actual biblical texts. You don't even know you're just like, I don't even know how to respond to that, except to say that that's not true. Like that, what he's saying is just simply not true.
Jeremiah 29:7 says, said to the exiles in Babylon who were surrounded by their enemies, who said, work for the shalom of your community. And then it says, because when your community is well, you will be well. So Pastor Jonathan Brooks, who's a pastor in Chicago, he's a trainer with the Christian Community Development Association, which I also have been a trainer for. And he does this training where he starts out by misquoting, by saying, Jeremiah 29:7 says, take care of your family. And if you do that, then your whole community will be blessed. And everybody goes, oh, yeah. And then he says, that's not what it says. It says, work for the shalom of your community, even if they're not you and not your friends. And then you and your family will be blessed. And so that you are so right that that people are not, in many churches, are not being taught the gospel in those ways.
Yeah, it seems like such a deceiving season where there's so much deception around like statistics, like you said, like there's this presentation that like also people are illegal somehow, but then also that they're all criminals, and that this is biblical. So there's these like layers of what seems to me like deception, but I love the answer to that being, okay, love. If you find yourself being driven by fear, then maybe that's enough to pause. Like fear is never a good driver. It will only ever lead to oppression, both for you and to others, right? So that idea of like, listen, if it's fear-based, then it's not from God. So, and then move towards, so something that you don't understand, instead of moving away from it, you move towards it, you embrace it, know people by name, learn the stories, start to ask questions. You said like, start asking creative questions. What are the solutions if this, is not the one? And then I guess know the authentic thing, like find the authentic. I've been telling people, maybe just reread the story of Jesus, literally read the Gospels again. Because I feel like even some of the other texts of the New Testament have been twisted and taken out of context and used against, like in so many other little injustice ways, where they just take one verse and they say, therefore, this means this. And you're like, but that's not in keeping with the witness or the experience or the life of
People
Jesus.
defended slavery and still
Right.
do around the world where there is slavery. It's because, they're not making Christ the center. You're right about that.
Right.
But,
Right.
I find, first of all, I find that it's very important to recognize that, and let me speak here again. I'm a Reformed pastor. I'm out of that tradition, is that there are fears that are legitimate in this
Right.
broken world.
Yep.
But you don't get to legitimate fears when you're being controlled by fear. That's why when you ask the question, what is there a better solution? Can I protect myself and love people? Well, it turns out you can, right? That not even that hard, right? Your country actually has a better immigration. So it's not that hard to make our immigration policy better and to make it fairer and to make it more effective. And all of those things go along together. Laws that are not fair are not effective. Prohibition couldn't stand in the United States. It didn't work because people didn't obey it and it wasn't fair. So it wasn't effective, right? In the end, slavery wasn't fair and so it wasn't effective. So you really do, if we had an effective immigration policy, we would have a sense that we had control over our borders because we would be welcoming the people that we needed and we would be integrating them. We would be helping them to be part of our society and we would be exercising compassion and we would be helping the people who came in because we were exercising our shared compassion. It's a shared burden with the whole world, right? We have more people who are fleeing for their lives in the whole world right now than at any time in human history. It's an international problem. We have what the Latin American immigration scholars call surplus people. These are people who no longer have a place where they are, either because of terrible violence and persecution or because of climate change or because that they no longer can survive where they are and they're on the move. And so as a world, we need to figure out who shelters whom. But nobody, certainly not the wealthiest country on earth, should say we're not sheltering anyone for the foreseeable
Well, and not only
future.
that, but we're not even helping. And, this gets more complicated, but much of our the reality of the reason some of these countries are in the state that they're in has to do with, we have some complicity in that story.
We do.
And so, the fact that there's not even any acknowledgement that the reason Venezuela is the way that it is because of America policies and secret missions and agendas that, perpetuated American wealth at the expense of people who now have to flee. And so now, I mean, it just seems like almost like a demonic system that keeps repeating itself. So we're going to take the problem, then we're going to blame you for the problem. Then the people that are fleeing the problem that we helped make, we're going to vilify and blame again. And then we're just going to keep repeating the cycle.
One of the stories, El Salvador is a success story. And I'm entering into controversial territory because I know there are lots of problems with the president. And I have very dear friends who are very upset with him. But there's a success story in El Salvador because back in 2014, El Salvador was hemorrhaging because of the level of violent persecution from gangs in league with the government. The current president, in some ways that were good and in some ways that were not good, got the gang problem under control with a lot of financial support from the United States. Kamala Harris's particular job was to help El Salvador and some of the other Central American countries to get to the place where people wouldn't need to run very successfully. So very few of the people at our border are from El Salvador because we work together, but we have just not only do we want to throw out current immigrants and keep any more from coming in, but we're also cutting off all foreign aid. So we're not actually, and we had a big hand in the problem happening in El Salvador that ended up with that gang issue, right?
Yeah.
We did, and that's a very long story. But even apart from that, by working together with them to solve the problem, by using U.S. aid strategically, which Marco Rubio says is the goal with U.S. aid, is to use it strategically. But that's not what's happening right now. What's happening is U.S. aid is abruptly cut off in places where we're funding orphanages. We're literally,
with food,
where children are going to starve.
malnourishment programs.
Yes.
Yeah, that's where we're shutting down.
So that's what, which doesn't make friends and influence it. People are also, right, which is, so even from a strategic perspective, but there's been very successful strategic efforts for international collaboration to make it so that people don't have to leave their homes. But this government is not committed to that, nor is it committed to helping people when they come, nor is it committed to receiving their contribution even when we need it. So it's not a rational government. It's people for whom power is the only. And I can't say that. God knows their hearts, but that's certainly how they're behaving. They're behaving as
and also
their
just
personal power is
right.
all that matters, and it doesn't matter who suffers, who dies. And that's just not who we are as a country. Certainly not who we are as Christians, but not even who we are as a country. That's not what our country was created for.
Yeah, it definitely is not. And then just add the lens of we say that we're Jesus followers. So what does the church, what do we do? So this is, I originally reached out to you to go how do people help? What do we do right now? So you have people who are cut off. You have people who are afraid to leave their homes. You have ICE, entering churches and schools. I mean, you have people who were here with an arrangement and a legal entry who have been literally made criminals overnight for something they did that was right and good and true. So what do? We have politicians who are afraid to say anything because they've been threatened. You have charities who are afraid to say anything publicly because they're being threatened with the loss of their charitable status if they criticize the government or speak out against these decisions.
Right.
This is unheard of in a country that has championed freedom of speech and human rights. It's shocking on so many levels.
So I want to say to people that, first of all, that this will require courage and it will require sacrifice. It will require us to give a testimony. Remember what Paul says about giving an account of our faith. That's not just about making a good argument. That's about living a life that in which people experience Jesus. That line, you are the only Bible that some people will ever read. So it takes us being little Christ, as Luther would say, in this world. And that means having the courage and the discipline and the hope and the willingness to sacrifice in a way that we have often as Christians in North America have never had to do. We've been allowed to be very soft. And I was in the Philippines for 3 years as a missionary when I was very young, part of the pro-democracy movement against the dictator, Ferdinand Marcos, which actually won and won nonviolently.
And
But
it
I
was
was with lots of
really fueled with
people.
Christians, right? It was Christians played a big
Yeah,
part in that
Christians played a
movement.
big part in that. The base Christian community movement was core to it. It was the spine. They talked about it as the spine of the movement. I think what I saw in that was I saw a church that was ready for spiritual warfare, a church that was ready to sacrifice and to love unto death. And I think we have to become that church. So that's first and foremost, that this is an opportunity for us to become true Christ followers, to pick up our cross and follow him. I think then the question of how, I think that non-immigrant churches need to build a real relationship with immigrant churches, because immigrant churches are on the front line right now and they need our support desperately. We don't need, churches that have no immigrants in them to try to take in people. The immigrant churches are there. They're in the community. They're growing. They're live. They just don't have much in the way of finances, and they're going to lose a lot of their supporters, right? Who are going to be deported, and families will not have breadwinners. And so they're going to need brothers and sisters to come alongside. There are the Latino Christian National Network, lcnn.org, is a coalition of national Christian leaders. That's a place that you can connect to try to find people in your community. But you can also just find people in your community, because there are immigrant churches in every community, and say, we're your brothers and sisters. How can we come alongside you and be supportive? And they may be a little scared because, they may think that that's who are you actually. Might take a little time to win trust, but that's really the most important thing you can do. And then, of course, like I said earlier, when you're in the middle of an uncontained fire, people are going to try to hold the perimeter. When you see people doing that, support them, stand with them. I was just talking to Michelle Warren the other day in Colorado, and she's going to visit legislators. And I said, why are you going to visit legislators, Michelle? What good is that? And she said, no, a lot of them are Christians. We have to go to them and ask them to have courage and ask them to have faith. I was like, you're right. We have to do that. That's holding the perimeter, right? Wherever we can do that, wherever we know we might have influence, where we might be able to encourage somebody, literally give them courage, we need to do it, right? When there's opportunities to hold the perimeter. And we also need to know that and putting out spot fires has to do with things happening in your own neighborhood, in your own community, in your own networks, in your own family, where people have been taken captive by an ideology that is nationalist, but actually not Christian. And so there's this little study called Taking America Back for God that was written it was not done by people who were Christian leaders. It was done by religious scholars of religion. But it was an analysis of Christian nationalism. But they noted that the difference between evangelicals, that they could say there's a difference between evangelicals and Christian nationalists, and the difference has to do with the response to immigrants and refugees. Because then if you're not a nationalist, if you understand that God loves all people, and you can be patriotic, I'm patriotic, but I'm not a nationalist, because I understand that God loves all people. And I understand that the body of Christ is in all countries in the world. And that's an allegiance that is at least as important as my country, if not more.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I think that, and I understand that Jesus said that whatever we do to the stranger, we do to him. I understand those things. And because I understand those things, I'm evangelical, but I'm not a Christian nationalist. And so I think where people are held captive by Christian nationalism, that we do have to call them back to the roots of our faith. As you said earlier, Danielle, with such eloquence, we have to say, what would Jesus do? That's at the core of what we have to ask ourselves and each other, because there's right now they're trying to figure out how to keep another fire like that from happening again. We really couldn't do it in the midst of the fire. But that's where the analogy breaks down, because even now, the kinds of prayer and education and calling people to their best that are long-term solutions, we actually even need on a short-term basis for the church to be the church at this particular moment in history.
Yeah. I mean, even like, prayer movements and things like that as we research and gather and, like you said, even just connect with some people from immigrant churches and say, even that line as you said it, like in an imaginative exercise, we're your brothers and sisters, how do we help?
We're your brothers and sisters, how can we help?
I mean, can you just imagine, like, that itself is just so moving because it's the opposite spirit of this like anti-Jesus spirit, which is, we are not brothers and sisters. We are not connected. Like, we are not, you are less, I am more, I'm centered, you're decentered, like all of those things. So it's such a powerful move in the opposite way of demonic energy.
Part of what it just is so exhausting to every time you hear publicly anybody talking about you, that you hear them condemning you as a criminal.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
We're doing some research on preachers in the Hispanic community. I was just reading a transcript of an interview, and he was talking about a woman in his church who just started crying because she said, my mother raised me to be a good Christian woman. My mother raised me, and now I'm a criminal. I'm not a criminal. And she was crying and crying, because the way she's being portrayed is as a criminal. But she's not a criminal. She is a refugee.
Thank you for telling the truth, for being at work in this. I feel like your background is so deeply steeped in training for such a moment as this. So I'm so thankful for you and who you are and your faithfulness and your commitment. And thanks for taking the time to share with us your wisdom and experience. And I'll put a link in this podcast so people want to go and actually have a look at the link that you mentioned, but also maybe some other links there. One of the things we were talking about is if you're part of a denomination, there might be an easy way within your denomination or your own sort of network to give to immigrant and places of great need right now as the funding is being cut.
That's right. If you're a Presbyterian, there's certainly some ways that Presbyterians are doing that. There's some Lutherans doing that. But also, you can connect with immigrant churches within your denomination, and that might be easier than trying to find somebody in your neighborhood. You might go through your denomination and say, who are the immigrant churches in our denomination? How can I help them? And your denomination may have a way to do that.
Yeah, and it's called a solidarity to this like Imago Deo, this like we're not just using rhetoric that we're brothers and sisters. This is what brothers and sisters do in crisis, is we stand together, we pick up the phone, how do I help? So that's what we can do. And some of that might just be human. We just do that in human relationships, which is why the church is unstoppable. It's not an organization, it's an organism. So like, let's start acting that way. Who are the trusted voices? That was the other piece that we had talked about. Like, who are the trusted voices? Where do people go to hear this kind of what is actually happening? Do you have some ways people can find those trusted voices?
Sure. So the Evangelical Immigration Table and the Interfaith Immigration Coalition are both, faith-based networks that track all of this. World Relief, who is deeply connected with the Evangelical Immigration Table. There's the National Immigration Forum. Yeah, that's an academic one. But the National Immigration Forum is very moderate, bipartisan, gives you all the latest information about this. So those are all good places for people to go. Some of the denominations are very good at this in particular. The Methodists are amazing. The Catholics are really good at it. They have departments that deal with immigration. In the Lutheran Church, there's a department called Amparo that deals with immigration. All of those folks make it their business to stay on top of the facts and not fall into partisan. So you can always, it's so interesting for me to see like Elon Musk calling the Lutheran Social Services, which has been doing the basic work of mercy and kindness in all communities around this country for 100 years.
Yeah.
And he called it a money laundering. It's like, how could your average Christian hear that and not know that?
And believe it. And not just find out what the average salary of a worker helping the poor is. That's the other thing. And compare it to the $480 billion that Elon Musk makes. And yeah, the Lutheran social services are the money laundering people, clearly. That's what's happening.
Literally, Lutheran social services helps refugees, but that's a tiny piece of what Lutheran's government finds that their money is more effectively spent working in partnership with the church. cheaper salaries and more volunteers. And so there's some government contracts, but there's some stuff they do without government contracts. But they literally do the elderly and babies. What is this?
Yeah. What is this indeed?
But I understand that once people get caught up in a fire, they're caught into captivity and they need liberation. But really, liberation doesn't come from bouncing back and forth from one side to another. It comes from, like you said, what are the sources that are moderate, that are careful? And again, you can go to the Catholic Church, you can go to the Lutheran Church, you can go to the Methodist Church. I don't know the equivalent in the Episcopal Church, but I'm sure there must be. And if you want to stay with the evangelical world, you can go to World Relief. They're solid. They have all this information.
Yeah, that's great.
The World Relief is the relief and development organization of the National Association of Evangelicals. And they've been around since 1940. And, they have really solid information. And you will hear what I've said repeated there.
Yeah. So this is wonderful. Everybody, I think it's worth not just hearing this podcast, but as this podcast has sparked, ideally, some curiosity, maybe even a chance for you to go, I didn't know it was that. I didn't know what was going on. And this curiosity, I would say, follow it, ask good questions, move towards people. If you don't know personally immigrants or refugees, and you're just hearing about them, go find out, go find them, go meet them, because that's one of the greatest ways to sort through misinformation. Watch your heart. Move closer to the person of Jesus, the Spirit of Christ, and the way of Jesus. And I love that challenge we were given today to find our courage. And finding our courage can't be done alone. It must be done together. So find our courage together. And keep asking this, how do I help? How do I serve? Those are good questions that will guide us too. So much for this time. And we'll follow it up for sure. There's lots more to be said. But thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. May God be with you and with all those who are listening. May He give you wisdom and strength for such a time as this.
Amen.